The Lord be with you. That's pretty good. We are so happy that you are here with us this evening. In a moment, we're going to pray, and then David will come and speak to us. But I just want to say a word of welcome to All Saints. We are so happy that you would be here. If you've never been here before, we're especially happy to welcome you. One of the real core distinctives of All Saints is believing that hospitality is a core marker of Christian fellowship. That includes kind of practicals of hospitality, like welcoming people in, providing food and clothing to the stranger. But it also involves creating a space where people can ask deep questions of life without worrying someone is going to yell at them or immediately correct them or anything like that. And so for about once a month for the past year, we've invited guest speakers to come in, ask a big question, and for us to have conversations spurred on that. So if any questions come up tonight based on David's talk, I would love to talk with you. Feel free to reach out to me. Philip, who I'll introduce here in a moment. Anybody here at All Saints, we would love to continue having a conversation with you going forward. So just a word about David. Most of you know David from his books and his podcast. He runs Mockingbird Ministry, has been for many years a minister to college students at UVA. And his new book, the subject of his talk tonight, is called Low Anthropology, which is a subject that just this morning someone cut me off in traffic, and I was so tempted to be frustrated with the person and ask, how could this person do that? And then I thought, low anthropology. I should not be surprised at Dallas traffic. Again, thank you so much for being here. Philip Jones, who is our rector, senior pastor here at All Saints, is going to pray for us, and then David will come up immediately afterwards.
Welcome to All Saints. The Lord be with you. Please stand as we pray together. Come, Holy Spirit. Say that with me. Come, Holy Spirit. You bring all truth to worship Jesus, to exercise your gifts, to renew our minds, to remind us of what it means to be fully human in Jesus, who shows us the way and transforms our hearts. I ask your blessing, Lord, on our time tonight over David. Bless him. Bless us. May your Holy Spirit fill this room with your protection, your peace, your power, and your purity. We pray this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction. So good to be here. I've never been in a church that's a converted car dealership. And I think it's really neat. I guess where the cars would come through, I guess the real question is like, what kind of a dealership was it? Was it, something cool or Chevrolet? Well, I'm not going to weigh in on that. I'm so happy to be here, though. Thank you to All Saints for having me and for inviting me, and for all of you for coming out on a Thursday evening. It's really neat to be here, and especially, I've been traveling around talking about this book for a couple months now, but I haven't gotten to do any of it with my wife, but she's able to join me tonight. She's right here. So thank you for allowing that to happen. And thank you to my parents for watching our three boys. So, low anthropology. I'm going to get into the subject by way of a couple different avenues. The first is, I'm glad she's here because a couple weeks ago she sent me this amazing podcast. Everyone's always sending you podcasts to listen to. Maybe they're sending you Mockingbird podcasts to listen to. I hope so. But I thought I had a drive, and I thought I'm going to actually listen to this because she's usually right about these things. And it was all about the science of regret. Science of Regret, and it was an interview between Maya Shankar and an author, Daniel Pink. Maybe you know Daniel Pink. He's sort of a business leader and a kind of always talking about leadership and stuff like that. And he's written a book last year called The Power of Regret. And it turns out in order to write this book, he decided to pioneer the largest study of regret that's ever been undertaken, at least in America. And he talked to 22,000 Americans about their regrets. And what he found was super interesting. First of all, one of the things he found was that I think it was 82% of people answered yes when asked if there were significant things about their life that they looked back on that they wish had gone differently. And then there were 17% of people who said no, but then went on to list a bunch of things that they wish had gone differently. And so I guess there's 1% of people that are just psychotic. What he found was that regret is usually about a decision that you made, not necessarily something that happened to you, but some sort of fork in the road that you took that you wish you had done differently. And what he found was something universal. He found that everyone harbors certain regrets. Now, he broke these down into different categories, and the most common regrets are connection regrets. Sort of you wish you'd spent more time with your grandmother before she died, or your children when they were little. Those are very common. There's boldness regrets, like you wish you'd quit your job at some point and went out on your own. Or you wish you'd pursued someone romantically that you just didn't have the guts to pursue. Boldness regrets. The ones that hung on the longest were moral regrets. And a lot of those have to do with bullying, for example. And he talks about how he witnessed a lot of bullying when he was a kid. And of course, he was never a bully, I'm sure. But he said that he witnessed it and didn't do anything about it. And he feels terrible about it all these years later. And those are the regrets that hang on the longest. One of the other things he found, though, was that when you're in your 20s, you regret actions and inactions in equal measure. By the time you're in your 40s and 50s, what do you think people regret more? Inaction by 8 to 1. It's like by 8 to 1. Partly because if you did something that was terrible or wrong, you can work to redress it. You can sort of make amends. You can ask for forgiveness. You can try to reconcile with the person. If you just didn't do something, then it just sits on your chest and kind of eats away at you. So this is... the reason I bring this up is because Maya Shankar asked Daniel Pink, she said, okay, you've spent 3 years like marinating in regret, just sitting there thinking about everyone's regrets. And some of the regrets that he had heard listed were absolutely heart-wrenching, the worst kind of thing, and some of them were petty and small. But she said to him, are you depressed? Are you doing okay? Are you all right? And he said, well, the funniest thing, I feel great. I feel great, and I feel two things. I feel less alone than I've ever felt, and I feel more connected to my fellow human beings than ever before. And so this idea that regret, which sounds like something so negative, to spend time there actually for him did not have a negative effect. It made him feel less alone. He wasn't the only one that had the exact same feeling of being on the schoolyard and watching someone get picked on and not doing anything about it. He thought that I was uniquely weak in that respect. He says, no, it turns out a lot of people deal with that. But also, he felt intense compassion for people that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise felt compassion for. Now, it's very interesting to me in a time where we can't really agree on anything, and it feels like people even have different facts that they're working from, and we're all so divided and just at each other's throats. And some people say that there's nothing universal. Here you have something that is very universal, not only universal, but a sort of a bridge-building experience. But it doesn't come through some sort of shared value, but through shared failure. and weakness and regret. So keep that in mind. The other thing I was thinking about is there's the sort of emblematic cartoon for this book. And I know most books have emblematic cartoons. Right? I'm kidding. The one that I had in mind when I was writing this book, and one of the things that shaped the writing of it, was this popular cartoon that someone had sent me a long time ago, and it's of a crowded city street, and it's everyone is sort of hurrying in different directions, and you have the young and the old, and you have men and women, you have people from different sort of backgrounds and ethnicities, and they're all not really talking to each other, and they all look kind of stressed out, and they have thought bubbles going up from their heads, and they're all thinking the exact same thing. Now, what do you think they're thinking? I asked this question in Nashville a couple weeks ago, and someone in the back said, they're thinking, WTF! But what do you think they're thinking? They're thinking, all these people really seem to have it together, and I still have no idea what's going on. People moving in different directions, different backgrounds, different experiences of life, all struggling with the same thing, which is commonly known today as imposter syndrome. Everyone feels like they're the only one who's making it up as they go along. It's a refrain, and in fact, if you're in, I've been in ministry for a long time, and everyone I talk to, you talk to people who are in counseling, and you hear this refrain from everyone, basically, when they're behind closed doors. They say, I just look at so-and-so in church, and that family just seems to have it completely together, and here we are just barely getting there on Sunday morning, and, look inside my car, it's just crumbs, it's just nothing but broken goldfish, and like, I don't know where the stickers from the grocery store just like found their way into this crevice. I don't get it, but it's disgusting. And if people really knew, then they would not take me seriously on Sunday. But it doesn't matter. It's any kind of, all sorts of, I preached a sermon one time about imposter syndrome at our church in Virginia. And so Charlottesville is where University of Virginia is. And there's an early morning service that we do. It's an Episcopal church, so it's like a solemn. If you go to church at 7:45 in the morning, you don't really want to talk to anyone, okay? You don't want to sing. There's no music. You're there to sort of do some business with God, possibly just to look guilty and then flee. And there's this one woman who is always come over the years, and I'm scared to death of her, because she's very intimidating and very sophisticated and is always dressed to the nines. And she was also known in town as being one of the first female STEM faculty, tenured faculty at the University of Virginia. She's a physics professor. And so, Sandy's her name. I've told her I'm using this on the road, and she would laugh because she was the sort of person who, like, if you're a preacher, some people say, great job. Some people say, oh my gosh, that hit me between the eyes, or, oh, how were you in our bedroom last night? Like, you hear that sort of thing. And then she is the one who always has like sticks the dagger in a little bit. It's like, well, you could have prepared a little more, sort of something like that. Or it's like, didn't you tell that story a number of times ago? Anyway, what she just had is, people who have an inability to give an actual compliment. They have to have like a tail on the end of it that kind of, you're like, wait a second, was that actually a compliment? So anyway, she came up to me and she said, David, thank you for preaching that sermon. I haven't told anyone this, but I retired a few years ago, and I spent my entire career frightened to death that someone would find out that I failed one of my key prereqs for my physics PhD program, and that somehow it got misentered into the system, and no one ever figured it out, and I've always thought that someone was going to come back, and they were going to revoke my degree and tell me that I'm a farce. And I said, well, you told the wrong guy. Like, I happen to know a few administrators, and we'll see what happens. No, but she was very dear, and I thought to myself, if she has a skeleton in the closet, if she feels like an imposter, if she spent her whole career feeling like an imposter, well, then maybe it's a universal thing. I've just spoken about two universal factors in life that relate to us. I thought you weren't just humoring me, you were actually laughing. There was a sense of, we were all acknowledging and wow, I feel like an imposter too. You know, there is something to be said for the enlivening and, in fact, compassion-inducing recognition of our shared, collected confusion and fear and, in fact, imposter syndrome or regret, whatever have you. And that is my way into a low anthropology. Now, what do I mean when I say low anthropology? An anthropology is, don't be put off by the $4 word. It is not a college course that I'm referring to. There's cultural anthropologists that study how, tribes in the Amazon, work together, or how, the people in the Australian outback have sort of, tools that they've made. And that's a different thing. Theologians and philosophers also use anthropology not as a highfalutin word, but as a shorthand for what your view of human nature is. Whatever your operating view of human nature is, that's your anthropology. And everyone has one. Well, what do I mean? Well, we all go through life with powerful and often unspoken ideas of what human beings are like. For example, we believe that people can always change. I heard that today on a television program right as we were coming in. Or I heard some people can never change. Or you often hear those people will never change. Or we believe that, if you really want to get someone to do what you want, put pressure on them. People react well to pressure. Or you hear some parenting guides say, never put pressure the least bit unless you want your kid living under a bridge one day. I mean, it's like we all have a sense of what makes people tick, of what people are capable of our limitations, of our liabilities, of our potentials, what principles govern our behavior and make us distinctly human. That is our anthropology. And whether we realize it or not, our personal anthropology, our view of human nature, it creates expectations in our relationships, in our jobs, in our self-understanding, of course, and definitely in our faith and our spiritual lives. Some anthropologies lead to serious disappointment and anger and cynicism. Other anthropologies can be energizing and life-giving, but what they cannot be is non-existent. Everyone has an anthropology. It may not be completely constructed and conscious, but it may not be consistent. Lord knows, someone who sounds very cynical, people are the worst, and then yet they're totally surprised when they get, cut off in traffic. They're shocked. How could this person be so callous? It's like, well, didn't you just tell me people are callous? Or you have people that think people are basically good, and yet in practice they seem to be always attributing the worst possible motives to other people. You know what I mean? Maybe you don't. Hopefully you do. You're at the wrong talk. The contention of this book is that seeing people as they truly are, as opposed to how we would have them be, is a crucial ingredient in generating authentic compassion and lasting love. An accurate anthropology opens us up to all sorts of unexpected vistas of hope. Now, it's not just, the book's not called anthropology, it's called low anthropology. So I chart anthropologies on a continuum of high to low. Think of it as like a barometer of human potential. On the high end, you find the sunnier estimations of what men and women are like. You run into sort of grandiose even visions of human enterprise and our future. The higher you get, the more optimistic the presuppositions. On the low end, you sit the more sober estimations. You find understandings of the human spirit as something which veers by default in a sort of more malign direction, and as a result cannot flourish without assistance, or constraint. You find descriptions of people as finite, blind, and in many cases in need of help. Now, what's ground zero for the proliferation of anthropologies? It's not actually churches. Graduation speeches. Anytime you're at a graduation from 4th grade, or a graduation from high school, or a graduation from university, you are going to hear an anthropology. You're going to hear some vision of what is worth achieving in life and how to get there. It's sort of impossible to avoid. This is funny. Apple guru in 2005, Steve Jobs, he drew on the high side of the anthropology equation when he told Stanford graduates, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow know what you truly want to become. Right? I gave this version of this talk out in LA last week at a church, and a young, she's a little younger than me actually, came up to me and said, I graduated from Stanford in 2005. I remember that speech, no, but only sort of because no one was really listening because it was 102 degrees outside. And so he did say that, but I also want to say that don't hate on all of us Stanford grads. We were sweltering and very uncomfortable. But so that's what he said, all right? Let that sit with you. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow know what you truly want to become. Sounds kind of inspiring, right? Especially if you're hearing it from the man who enslaved the entire human race. I kid. Do I kid? Put your phone away. All right. Anne Lamott is sort of the patron saint of low anthropology. She is a writer, a Christian writer, hippie, mystic sort of out in L.A., and she says the following, or she's Marion County. She's got the hippie roots run deep. She said this in a similar graduation speech. She said, everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared, even the people who seem to have it more or less together. They are much more like you than you would believe, so try not to compare your insides to their outsides. All right, Anne. So high anthropology views people as defined by their best days and their greatest achievements, their dreams and their aspirations. A low anthropology does not ignore those things or discount those things, but it says that the much more accurate through line connecting you to me more reliably is grief, loss, heartache, self-doubt. I can assume with almost total confidence that the bulk of your mental energy is spent the way that the bulk of mine is spent. In other words, on subjects that would be embarrassing or even shameful if broadcast widely. And that our ability to do the right thing in any given situation is hampered by all sorts of unseen factors. Okay? I know it sounds a little kind of sad, but note your responses to Jobs and Lamott. On the one hand, Lamott's words sound a little harsh, right? I mean, I know, we all laughed. I mean, I may be a little scared and clingy, but everyone? Isn't that extreme? That guy Miles I went to high school with seemed very comfortable in his own skin, So-and-so Sherry down the street seems to have a real pep in her step. Plus, if I heard one of my kids come home from school and say, hey, Dad, guess what I learned today? Everyone is scared, clingy, broken, and screwed up. I'd say, no, son. You're just having a bad day. They would never hear that where my kids go to school. But you would assume they were depressed or they were in a bad mood. On the other hand, Steve Jobs' invitation, again, must have inspired those graduates, wouldn't you think? I mean, how fortunate they were to walk away knowing that they already possessed everything they needed to become the next Steve Jobs. Pretty great, I think. But say you had a tough week. Say, like Dustin, someone cut you off in traffic and you said something under your breath or perhaps over your breath that you don't want broadcast. Say you spoke insensitively to a loved one. Say you fumbled the ball at work or with your kids or at school. Well, Lamott's description might all of a sudden strike you as more accurate. You might feel recognized by her words and frankly a little burdened by Steve Jobs' exhortation. After all, you're no longer 22, you're 43, and you don't always like where your intuitions have steered you or what you've become. Or perhaps you can't help but look at your sibling and think, well, why'd they get such better intuition than I got? Why were they able to listen to it better than me? What's wrong with me? Where's my good intuition? Huh? Well, Lamott's admission conveys compassion. You can feel your shoulders unknot. Steve Jobs' advice, not so much. His words convey pressure. This is the great irony of a low anthropology. What sounds insulting is actually liberating, and what sounds liberating at first is actually oppressive and embittering. Now, didn't you come to a Christian talk, right? Trust me, this is all my way of like trying to get into why faith in God would be compelling or urgent in the first place. We are living in a time marked by deep division and acrimony, and people from different backgrounds and ideologies have never had a harder time speaking to or listening to one another. And the result is a fraying social fabric that infects our day-to-day with the worst kind of tribalism. You cannot turn on the TV or walk past, CNN airport, whatever it's called that I walked past today, without breathing in some of the fumes of blame and acrimony and finger-wagging. Much of our despair, I'm convinced, is fueled by a superficial view of human nature. It's a near default view that flatters us with fantasies about our capacities and our motivations, but fails to account for the actual data of our lives, leaving us lonelier and more burned out as a result. I personally hear from so many people who feel burdened by the pressure to perform an ideal version of themselves, and I feel it myself. And it's gross, but it's painful too. Here's the thing. By editing out the less savory stuff about our humanity, we also snuff out solidarity, empathy, vulnerability, all the things that were flowing so freely when I talked about regret and imposter syndrome. We snuff out love. All of a sudden we think we're the only one with problems, the only one barely hanging on, the only one who doesn't belong. But thank God the truth of who we are is more comprehensive. Low anthropology is my attempt to cut through the noise with hope, highlighting this counterintuitive truth that weakness and limitation can function as a doorway to compassion, unity, grace, and ultimately faith. I'm convinced that if you want to see an increase in hope and understanding amidst the engulfing mercilessness of today, especially if you want to communicate anything approaching or resembling the grace of God, you must begin with a low anthropology. I happen to believe that a low anthropology goes hand in glove with a high Christology, a sort of a sense that if, as a Christian, I come to this looking at the lives of believers who I highly admire, and the common theme is always at the end of their life they have a sense of their own smallness and a sense of God's largeness. They have a sense of deeper dependence on God rather than a larger appreciation of their own contribution somehow to the world's goodness. And that to me is that a beautiful picture of the freeing good news that a low anthropology prefaces. Now, I've also found that religion in general and Christianity in particular makes very little sense in the context of a high anthropology. After all, it's Jesus himself who said that he had come not to call the righteous but sinners. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I'll close before we do some Q&A with this quote from Brian Stevenson, who some of you may know. He's the advocate he's done a lot of advocacy work for men on death row. An amazing man. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, which I highly commend to you. And it documents his advocacy on behalf of men on death row. And they're not nice characters. Most of them are convicted of very violent and heinous crimes. They occupy the lowest rung on society, and they're very rarely the recipient of any kind of interest or sympathy from the outside world. Now, how does Brian keep going year after year when the cards seem so stacked against him and his clients? Is it because he has a deep belief in the overarching nobility of human beings? Well, probably he thinks that people have dignity, no doubt. But what actually keeps him coming back to the plate over and over again? This is what he says. He says, I do what I do because I'm broken too. We are all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. We all share the condition of brokenness, even if our brokenness is not equivalent. I desperately wanted mercy for a client, but I couldn't pretend that his struggle was disconnected from my own. Our shared brokenness connected us. Our brokenness is also the source of our common humanity, the basis for our shared search for comfort, meaning, and healing. Our shared vulnerability and imperfection nurtures and sustains our capacity for compassion. So that's what he said, and I think it's actually true. And so that's what this book is meant to be about. And yes, I do bring in the scriptures at great length, and I talk about how low anthropology and high anthropology plays out in religion, but I also talk about it in terms of relationships and in terms of our self-understanding, even in the ways we try to avoid this and the ways in which the fruit that it often bears, the curiosity, the humor, the unity, the friendship, and ultimately the faith that is birthed when you come to the end of yourself. So that's my pitch. Now we're going to have some Q&A. Are we going to sit together?
Yeah, that'll be great.
All right.
Hopefully this spurred some thoughts. In your mind, we have microphones on either side of the sanctuary. We would invite you to ask any question that you like. We would ask that the questions be formed in the form of a question would be helpful, but we would love to hear what you've been thinking about. I'll ask the first question, which is about, you mentioned your parents were watching your kids. I want to ask about your dad. Some people in here will know your father, Paul Zahl. Some won't, so just by way of introduction, Paul Zahl is a priest and theologian. Growing up, I always heard people talk about sin. They would say, like in a sermon, we all know what greed is like. You might go through a parking lot and there are really nice cars. You struggle with greed. Or they might say, we know what pride's like if you win a football game, you have pride. When I was about 19, I heard your dad preach, and he said, it's like when you're at a bus stop, and there's somebody there, and they didn't do anything to you, they're just a well-dressed lady, and you think to yourself, as the bus is coming up, what if I just pushed her in front of the bus and watched her die? And I remember hearing that and thinking to myself, yeah, I have those kinds of thoughts. I didn't really play football, but I get that, because I have to. So I wonder if you'd just say something about the fingerprints your dad left, not just in the book, but also just what it's like growing up with a guy like that.
Well, the phrase low anthropology, it actually originates with him. Yeah. Low anthropology originates from him. And it's always in the way of trying to talk about a low anthropology produces a high Christology. But he also would say that he one time talked about in a sermon, and he got more feedback about this than any other thing. He said, have you ever been unloading the dishwasher, and you grab one of the knives, and you realize, if I really wanted to, I could murder that person in my family right next to me. And that level of candor, I think, really takes people aback. But I've been at a couple different places where people have said that when I heard that, I said, I want to hear what the rest of this guy has to say. Because I've had that same feeling. Let me say this. If you read the book, yes, my dad's had a tremendous impact on me. And his love for people, he actually loves people, but it is so wrapped up in an appreciation of their eccentricities and his own and his humanity. I never dealt with the strong silent type, and that's was actually a real gift to me. And what that meant is that today the buzzword is vulnerability, but he didn't know how to be anything other than himself. So what that translated to me was a permission to not have to be perfect or to have it all together. I mean, there's high-achieving sort of stuff that all parents sort of, whether they want to or not, pass on to their children. But I'll say this about low anthropology, it's not strictly a euphemism for sin. It includes that. So I talk about 3 different pillars of a low anthropology. One is limitation. The first one is limitation, which is simply that contrary to how we're marketed to, we cannot do it all. We cannot know it all. So any of these certainties that we're living in a time of immense warring certainties, and that's based on a fiction. Because no one has comprehensive understanding of anything. We may have confident and thorough understanding of something, but complete comprehensive understanding simply does not exist. We're incomplete people who are planted in a time and place. None of us have access to the full truth about anything. As a Christian, I believe God does, not me. So that's limitation. Limitation means we cannot do it all, we cannot know it all. And there's, we think, oh, duh. But, to be a person with strong limitations, I need sleep, I need food, I can only be in one place at a time, there's only 24 hours in a day. That's not depressing or moral judgment, that's simply the reality. And yet we sort of have to push against that in certain, the way that, so there's something about it that we reject that. The second is doubleness. The second pillar of a low anthropology is doubleness, which is another word for conflictedness. It's sort of if you've seen the movie Inside Out, it captures the fact that we're emotional creatures primarily rather than intellectual creatures, and that we're actually a jumble of desires and motivations. This is Augustinian if you're a Christian, but it's our motivations are never totally clear-cut, such that we're often a mystery to ourselves, and we act in ways that baffle us. And so that's doubleness. And any kind of experience of addiction, you're dealing with someone who just knowing what they should do. It's the Romans 7's experience of life. Knowing what I should do and being able to actually do it are often 2 different things. Now, sometimes that has a moral component, as in the case of like addiction. Sometimes it's just, I can't help but, poke the bear. The third pillar is self-centeredness, and that is sin. That's just simply that there is a darker side to human nature, and if you don't have any appreciation for that, you're going to be immensely confused by history and by your own self. And it doesn't excuse it, but it does say there is actually a moral component to some of this sort of the way it plays out. It's not just that we're a jumble of desires, but sometimes our desire, as I watch my children, is to actually cause pain, is to actually to pinch my brother, or to say the mean thing to the other girl on the bus, and just to watch what happens. That's very true. So those are the 3 pillars, and what that has to do with my father, I don't know, except for he likes the book a whole lot, I'll say that.
If he didn't, that would be big news too.
That would be awkward.
I can keep asking questions. Welcome to make your way to a microphone if you have a question, and it looks like we have one.
Thank you. You mentioned tribalism. We're isolated, but we have so much in common. So talk to us about how do we bridge that gap? What kind of questions, what kind of conversations? Some of us don't have the sense of humor you have, and the ability to be maybe so open. I have a knife here that I might put in the person next to me, so that's not always a great opening line. So talk about what we do with this information to bridge the gap and build relationships and engage in that conversation.
Well, so the book was born out of 2 principal social dilemmas or phenomena that I experienced myself and I think caused a great deal of pain. And the first one is burnout that we see, and it's not just professionals in their 40s who are burned out. It's also mothers of young children, and it's middle schoolers, and it's retirees, and it's just like basically everyone is burned out, which means we're all operating on a sort of a sense that life is demanding more of us than we can possibly produce. And the second thing is loneliness. Like if you look, especially among men, it's just skyrocketed if you've been reading the news recently. But loneliness is so prevalent in our society. I think a lot of it has to do with this intolerance of weakness. And if you're constantly having to parade your virtue or your lovability through social media or through whatever, you're never going to actually be known because you're never going to say anything that's not likable. And so you'll feel just lonelier as a result. So I think loneliness, no one actually, people will admit anything before they'll admit they're lonely. But people talk about burnout very, very easily. That's one question to ask. But if it's really true, if you think about your ideological enemy, the person that you have in mind when you read the article that definitively proves your point and you can't wait to send it to that person, this is the one. If my uncle read this, then he would stop posting that stuff. Or if my daughter saw this, finally she would understand how, crazy she is or something like that. But whoever that is, if you sit down with them for 5 minutes, if you find out what they're actually worried about and what they're actually struggling with, you automatically find a way to connect. It's just classic. It's the person who you still don't have to condone their attitude or their position about such and such, but you just find yourself softening immediately when you find out that this person who seems to be so hateful in certain ways also lost a child, or they're struggling with a diagnosis that they don't know about. And so that's part of what we lose when we don't get in touch with people. But I find that folks are usually pretty open about talking about what they're worried about, and it's all that it takes. So it's not the questions, it's not the cocktail questions about what are you most proud of this past year. It's always the cocktail party questions. It's like, well, what would you change about your last year if you could, or something like that? What's your deepest regret? But if you look at all these books that are out about vulnerability, and I'm talking about Brene Brown, is she in Texas? She's in Houston, and I generally think this is great stuff. It's far better than the opposite. There's a total allergy to talking about anything moral, but a lot of it is, to me, it displays a hunger to talk about our lives as we actually live them, as opposed to this facade of perfection that we're all exhausted by this. And the popularity of her persona and her material, to me, revealed on a massive scale that everyone was basically lying all the time, and they were extremely hungry for what they call authenticity or vulnerability, and that women were really resonated, but so did men. And there's not much permission to talk about what's really true. Now, I think another thing. As a Christian, I think good churches are this way. I think that if you're at least in a liturgical tradition, we come in and we talk about how God, from whom all desires known, no secrets are hid. And then you have a confession of sin, which is, by coming through this door, you're admitting that you're a person that is not only in need of friendship and collaboration, you need God. So I think that element of humility is a beautiful thing when it's not but when it's also met with the proclamation of the gospel of God's love. So that can be a technology of the heart that's very, very effective when it's done well. When it's done poorly, it can cause a whole lot of damage.
Yeah, please. Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to. You can line up at the microphones. Yeah.
Yes.
God gave you a microphone. Yes, but if you do line up to a microphone, we'll know who's kind of next, that kind of thing. Go ahead. You're good. Yeah.
So, in an area like Dallas that is highly spiritualized, extremely performance-driven to do great things for God, I would say it has a high anthropology. So, what would be characteristics of a church with a high anthropology?
What's characteristic of a church with a high anthropology? I don't want to, most pastors are doing the best they can. They've had a really rough couple years, so I don't want to, make them feel worse. I think, generally speaking, spiritual burnout is a very real thing, and it is, if ever you hear someone said, I just couldn't keep it up anymore, they've been a part of some kind of spiritual, religious environment that has operating on a high anthropology. Or that it's what I call selectively high anthropology. It was, you were drawn to the faith because you heard about forgiveness and second chances, and you heard about the grace of God, and then once you got in the door, then it was sort of, you were slowly and sometimes secretly or unintentionally met with a bunch of new expectations about and capacities, and that has a way of driving people away completely. So that's what I call selectively high anthropology. I don't always think it's conscious. I think it's a hard thing to guard against, and Lord knows we're all guilty of it. But those are two things. I think if does church start to feel like homework? I mean, do you start to feel like is it dealing with the biggest problems of the world and death and forgiveness and guilt, and or is it just dealing with highly contextual, minor cultural issues? Not minor. I don't want to. But you know what I'm talking about. Stuff that is gone tomorrow, or are we talking about something eternal? Wait, what was the? Oh, who came to? Okay, yeah. I had one of these moments that was kind of really touching to my wife and I, but I guess it was a low anthropology moment because we had this babysitter a wonderful girl who was babysitting for our very rambunctious boys twice a week, and she couldn't come one Wednesday. So she got her friend, and her friend, she asked her friend, and her friend found out that I was in ministry, and I was basically a pastor. I play one on TV, and she said, I don't know about that. I got some history, did a lot of young life stuff, and had just had some bad experiences, nothing against, anything specific ministry, but she had said that her experience of pastors had been that she'd go into their houses and it would just be a lot of Bibles. And the kids it was very clear what the kids weren't allowed to do and not very clear what they were allowed to do. And I didn't know that any of this internal dialogue was going on, but then she came over to our house. And she walked in the door. I said, "You're Abby? Oh, hi. Great to meet you. See ya. I'm out of here." And the kids, I don't know, are shooting each other with something, and it's a mess. And she didn't find any Bibles, I guess. But she's now in charge of the nursery at our church, and is has never missed a Sunday. And I guess it was because she saw two Christians that were just bigger failures than her. So. I hesitate to use Kate and I as a paragon of anything, but we found that out also 5 years after it happened. We're like, what? That's how you came to this church? I don't know if I should tell this story.
I hope I don't start coughing. So I'm just curious how you talk about low anthropology with college students and how they receive that, because I feel like at least my husband and I's understanding of low anthropology has significantly deepened with having young kids. And up until this point, it was a great theory and we subscribed to it, but fully experiencing, we're being humbled right now, and amongst other things. But just curious if that's hard with college students.
I find that college students are very, very receptive to ideas of low anthropology. The air they breathe nonstop is audiences. They think more in terms of audience than I ever did when I was a college student. I know what my professor wants me to hear me say, so I know I'm going to have to say it, rather than a learning environment. This varies from place to place, but the pressure you're dealing with a generation of kids who Steve Jobs basically ruined their mental health. Well, the iPhone came out in 2011, and it's been like that with these kids. And I'm the chief of sinners here, but they know what it is like to not feel like you can be yourself, or that one false move and you're dead. I talk to guys who and girls too, but like, when you're doing online learning, they're deathly afraid that someone's going to take a screenshot of something they said that they shouldn't have said, and there's no permission to just be a 19-year-old doofus. So it's like so I find that the pressure they feel to perform in all aspects of their lives is pretty acute. They don't have to be coaxed into it to understanding low anthropology.
So is there a danger in having too low of an anthropology that gets into cynicism and also others, people, and you hear, oh, people are animals, that kind of.
Yeah.
And where is the theology of us as image bearers, and how does that play into a low anthropology?
Yes, I mean, that's a very important point, because the notion of original sin has been, to use the modern words, it's been weaponized against people to make them feel just awful. There's a very key line at the beginning of the book, and I think it's worth saying, is that it's not shame-inducing and defeating to say that you cannot do it all, know it all, be it all. It is shame-inducing and defeating to say that you can, you just haven't pulled it off yet. So in a certain sense, people's anthropology, generally speaking, isn't low enough. The pushback against cynicism is usually a certainty about other people that I find to be congruent with a high anthropology. A low anthropology says, I can be fairly confident that you are going to react in this way or that way or this way, or that people are always like this. But a low anthropology actually says that I can't be 100% certain about that. And so it holds out the door for hope and surprise. And of course, our lives are all testaments to the fact that good things happen with alarming frequency, given how limited we and screwed up we actually are. So it's a different distinction between a kind of a view of the world where you just are resenting it for not being better or conforming to your own version of goodness, versus a vision of the world that is more of like at least, or is in awe and wonder at the amount of beauty and goodness that's on offer in the world and God's hand in the middle of it. I want to say, though, that yes, the way that I find that in Christian circles, the way that low anthropology is misunderstood is often in this form of, you are awful, now stop it. That's not low enough. That is way too high. A low anthropology, it says, in some key important ways, you are not up to the task of goodness and life. And yet, God is greater than you. That's what a low anthropology says. A high anthropology says you are the worst, but somehow you also have it within yourself to not be. So just quit. And that is that pits a person against themselves, and it cuts off recourse to God in a way that I find to be deeply nihilistic. So, that said, I also just don't think we're suffering from there is something a little contextual about low anthropology, and such that, let me say that if you're a person who grew up with nothing but you are a worm and incapable of contributing anything good to the world, it is very great to hear Steve Jobs tell you that you are capable of contributing something important to society. I do think that's true, or having a parent say that. I mean, I don't think you're necessarily graduating from Stanford if that's your background, but I think that I do think that there are situations in which people have been taught genuine self-loathing and hatred. And in that case, you do need to be reminded of that you are actually created in God's image. You are capable of all sorts of gifts and wonderful things. The context in which I grew up was much more one of entitlement. That's the word that's used today, where there's nothing wrong with you. It's like Jerry Seinfeld's parents. How could anyone not like you? It's like, you're so amazing. It's much more of like there's nothing inherently wrong with anyone. The only limitations are the ones we put on ourselves or society has put on us. There's no sort of dark side that's any kind of, and that produces a different sort of self-loathing. It produces this sort of, there was a great article about how to land your kid in therapy. And it basically described, not my father, but the schools I went to growing up, which preached a sort of exceptionalism and high anthropology that produced entitlement and also crippling shame when you turned out to be the only one. You felt you were the only one who had problems, or you finally experienced the least setback, and you thought, oh my gosh, everyone's lied to me my whole life. You know, maybe I'm not as perfect as my parents said. That sort of thing. Does that shed a little light?
As we draw our time to a close, we can have one last question, and just before that question is asked, David has kindly agreed to sign books afterwards. There are books for sale. We said David runs a ministry called Mockingbird. There's a sheet out there. I think you can put your probably name and email address on, get updates about Mockingbird. We're so happy that you came. As we said, we do this once a month in December. Sandra McCracken will be here, and we'll do kind of a Christmas carol sing-along. We would love for you to come to that. We'll send you an email about that. Last question. I'm sure it's going to be a great one.
Okay, first, I'd like to thank you for taking 4 years off of my life and making me 43 again. My introduction to imposter syndrome was a book written about 25 plus or minus 10 or 15 years ago. And that was strictly a psychology and more to do with your job, your vocation. And so what I hear today really is a more holistic view, which I'm thankful for. And that's why I wanted to come. So
Thank you.
that book, incidentally, did a lot of good for me in my own vocation. Because
Wow.
it let me know that, yeah, I'm all right with my shortcomings, and my boss has got shortcomings, and so on. So, yeah,
Thank you.
it's a good concept, but I appreciate what you've done.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for saying so.
A great place to end. Let's all express our gratitude to David. Oh, wait.
We got to do this. You knew it was coming, okay? All right, everyone. Say low anthropology. All right, great. I'll see you out there.
Thank you all for coming. You're dismissed.